So when we talk about war, so the war in Afghanistan is how we preface the book, but we spend quite a bit of time talking about the war in Iraq. And you're absolutely right that one of the things that is critically important for this discussion is that when you're talking about media reporting, the information that you're getting is coming through the government. So when it comes to talking about the war in Iraq, for example, we talk about the process of embedding journalists in conflict, which from my understanding, I'm not a journalist by trade, is highly controversial, because if you are with the people who are physically responsible for your safety, you're unlikely to offer a particularly critical take of what it is that those individuals are doing. But even more than that, we see things like talking points that are being crafted by members of the Bush White House to be put out into mainstream media. You have information that is being sent to large newspapers, for instance, that then officials are citing as being the original source, whereas the original source was actually the White House itself. Or you have things like the Bush administration putting quote unquote unbiased experts in the limelight on major cable networks, whereas in fact they weren't unbiased experts. They were individuals who had been supplied by the Bush White House.
I think the point that you make there about sort of the government playing the middleman in one, like giving information, of course, on like war efforts abroad, but then also there being sort of a self-consciousness about how to report on military activities by the media because they are so close to them in many cases. That connects right over to one of the main cruxes of your book, which is the aspect of paid patriotism. And this comes in the form of pop culture, sports displays, movies, and sort of how the government utilizes those sorts of mechanisms to activate propaganda methods, right? To control the message. Like when a movie studio needs to shoot in a certain location and perhaps use an Air Force base to do it, they end up having to go through the U.S. military's processes on what the movie is about, what's in the script, all sorts of other instances. Can you unpack that a little bit for folks?
Sure. So in the book, we talk about a few different cases. So I mentioned already the war in Iraq. We talk in detail about the lead up to the conflict, but then also, too, we talk about what happened afterwards, because there was a big change in narrative after the war started than before. But we also talk about things like the TSA. We talk about paid patriotism or propaganda in sports, and then we talk about propaganda in film. So when we talk about paid patriotism, for example, what do I mean by that? Back in 2012, there was a minor scandal, and I say minor because it popped up for a little while, but then pretty quickly fizzled out, which basically it came out that the Department of Defense had paid major sports franchises. So think in particular the NFL, NHL, Major League Baseball, the NBA, and so on, that the DoD had paid these major sports franchises to engage in patriotic displays. So think about surprise homecomings or members of the National Guard singing the national anthem, full field flag displays, and so on. These things were not genuine displays of patriotism on the part of the organizations that put them on, but instead had been bought and paid for by the DoD. My co-author and I argue that these millions of dollars that were spent for these various displays were intended to just foster this broader culture of militarism and support for the war on terror. This is similar to what it is that we see when we look at propaganda in film. And you mentioned, I think very succinctly, the process, which is that the DoD will provide, sometimes at reduced or free of charge, various pieces of equipment, locations, personnel, and so on to film studios in exchange for a say in the editorial process.
Yeah, you want to use
so
attack
if you're trying to make
you want to use the attack helicopter for your movie, then you can have it, but...
Right, but they do it in exchange for a say in the editorial process. So we document cases and we draw from literature that has looked at this in pretty extensive detail. You see things like entire characters that get scrubbed from films, or entire plot lines that are completely altered or otherwise just jettisoned.